Hello everybody, welcome to number 27, I'm Jack, and this is a 1970 Maserati Ghibli, Italian pronunciation, Spyder. Now this is a car that dates back to the times when Maserati still made the best cars in the world. This is a prime example of that, so in this video I'm going to tell you what made them so good, and we're going to take it out and also see how it drives. Maserati did seem to lurch from one crisis to another, but actually the period of time when these were built, which was 67 to 72, coincided with the ownership of the Orsi family, and it was relatively stable. They'd left behind the Grand Prix racing and all the demands that had, and they hadn't yet gone through the tumultuous times that came later, being taken over by Citroën. And incredibly, the Ghibli was their most expensive car, but it was also their big seller. They sold almost 1,300 of them, which is almost as many as the Daytonas, which was, I think, 1,350 made. Yet today, these are about half the value. At this point in time, Maserati had a real knack for appealing to its core customer group. And what that core group wanted was a really good quality, well-finished, comfortable car that had some racing heritage, but without all the inconvenience that comes from using the latest developments, for example, mid-engined cars. As a result, this has an incredible engine, which we'll talk about more in a moment, but the rest of the car isn't really very cutting edge. So we have double wishbones at the front, fair enough, but a solid axle at the rear with leaf springs. We have worm and roller steering, and then just a standard, fairly old-fashioned, almost by this point still, tubular steel chassis. They were, though, cars that were made to be used. So if you look at this interior, I'm 6'1". There's loads of room in here. To be fair, it is a big car, but there's loads of room. The driving position is pretty much spot on. There's no sort of terrible angles. The pedal box isn't really crushed in. It doesn't have the typical Italian driving position. And the interior is very nice and well finished. Also very unusual at the time is that the steering wheel is actually adjustable. We take that for granted now, but look, not only does this have the tilt angle, but also the length is adjustable. There's two little levers here, which are really easy to operate. One on the right-hand side for tilt, and this one for push, or it might be the other way around. But this is what this car is really all about. This is a race-derived 4.7 litre V8. It was originally in the 450S, and just look at how beautiful, how amazing that car is. So this is a quad cam 4.7 litre V8 putting out 310 horsepower. It's also dry sumped. Obviously that will aid handling, but in this case people wonder how much it was for handling or looks, because obviously it allows it to be lower and you get a lower bonnet line for that incredible silhouette. Once you hear how it sounds, you'll understand why people were so seduced by this car. Now let's just get one thing out of the way. This is possibly the car with the weirdest parking brake location other than maybe the Lamborghini LMO2 that I did a few weeks ago. It is so much in the way, you risk touching it with your foot as you're applying the throttle, so that isn't great, Maserati. What were you doing? I'm shocked. So un-Italian of you. Now, there were two versions of this. There was the standard car and there was the SS, and of course there was the Spyder, which I'm in at the moment. I'll give you a little bit of history on both. So, the first car was the 4.7 litre, and that was the sort of standard V8. They then made the upgraded SS version, which was a 4.9 and supposedly had another 30 horsepower. Now I've heard variously from different people that there's hardly any difference between them, or there's more difference than you'd think. I don't know. This is the 4.7 anyway, and it is absolutely delightful. I love it. The Spyder was another thing altogether, because Maserati didn't do the Spyder version themselves. They commissioned either Ghia or Campana, who were next door to them, to do the conversion. I don't know who you're going to believe about who did it. It's not clear whether it was Campana or Ghia. But the thing is, they did 125 of them, decided they weren't making enough money, and they stopped. So after that point, customers would go with their proper coupe Ghiblis to Campana, who are next door to Maserati, and get them to convert the cars. This is one such car. They are pretty much identical to the originals, as much as I've been able to find out, but the originals go for something like 3 times the price, of course. Now, the elegance of this car is just something to behold. It was a Gandini design, and I think it's one of his best, and you really have to see it in the flesh for the proportions and everything to strike you properly, because in pictures and in videos that I've seen, it just doesn't do it justice. It's got lots of shade of Daytona, or rather the Daytona has lots of shades of this car, because of course the Daytona I think came slightly after it. But how does it drive? Well, I've already mentioned the placement of that handbrake, the gear change as well. It's a sort of ZF Vox, and it's a little bit recalcitrant, it's a little bit notchy, and sometimes it can be difficult to find gears. I have no doubt that once you've driven it for a while, that would no longer be an issue. It's quite light, it's not a difficult gear change in that way. What immediately hits you is just the torque that this engine seems to have. I mean, it will pull in almost any gear from what I've seen, around 1,000 RPM. It is absolutely astonishing for a car of this time. It's just so well mannered. It sounds lovely, but without completely dominating the car. I mean, it does it in a muscular way maybe, but it doesn't really, it's not overbearing. It's got that sort of big cubic inch American feel to it initially. The steering, let's be honest, it's really quite vague. I think it's one of the areas that has received the most negative commentary, that these don't particularly steer that well. Well, it depends what kind of car you think it's going to be. They're so massive that I don't think you're ever going to expect this to be anything other than a big continent-crushing GT. And so the fact that the steering is a little bit vague off-centre, definitely vague off-centre, it's quite light, it's not very communicative, well, doesn't really seem to be such a big issue, does it? So the trade-off of that is that even on roads like this, where we're just not suited to this type of car, it is all about ease of the drive. So the steering may not be communicative, but it is very light. And you've got that engine that you can kind of forget about. You can leave it in gear and just sort of tickle it along. The throttle's really lovely and light, immediately responsive. So it makes driving easier, and I think that's what these were all about. They weren't about being the ultimate sports car. They were more about having something which was an incredible tourer, but with a nod to racing heritage. Let's just quickly tickle that engine. Very, very linear. The note hardens up noticeably. Quite a nice way, actually. And it just sounds absolutely gorgeous. Now the gear ratios are really, really long, so it feels like it just wants to carry on going indefinitely, but it just gets louder and louder and meaner as you sort of rev it past 4.5, then 5. Redlined at 5.5, and with the kind of torque that it has, you really don't need to get it anywhere near close to that. For an old car of this era, it's still got plenty to go. They were supposed to do 170 miles an hour, 0 to 60 in 6.8 seconds. Not sure quite how realistic those figures are, but certainly you can feel the muscle in this Maserati. And I think that's the key to what they did right in these days. They weren't trying to rival anyone, they were making their own product. It feels very much like piloting a powerboat, from that light, very slow, vague feeling to the size of it and the way this whole sort of dash looks. And that sound, that really unstressed engine, it just feels so relaxed. Now on smooth roads it's absolutely fine, but the moment that you go on a road which has broken up, the limitations of that suspension become apparent. Now Mark, thank you so much Mark for letting me out in this wonderful car today, by the way. Now Mark, who owns it, said that he doesn't think the rear suspension is quite right. Certainly it's on leaf springs, they've been changed. This does happen with these sort of aftermarket setups sometimes, that they're not quite the same ratio as the originals were, and it's riding quite high and it does feel quite stiff at the back. It doesn't really deal with brakes in the road that well. The whole thing sort of shakes. The front's definitely a bit better. Now this was the time when Maserati was still the car that was the car of kings, of princes. I mean, I know various emirs had them, and the Shah of Persia. Also Henry Ford II had one, and he got quite a hard time from his people because he used to take it into his office and park it in the Ford lot. And when confronted, he said, "You make me a car as beautiful as that, so you make me a Ford as beautiful as the Ghibli, and then I'll stop driving the Maserati and I'll start driving a Ford." It can go, and because it is vague, that's fine on a smooth wide road. On a little road like this, it moves around a little bit. As I said, it's that back end as well, doesn't feel like it's working that well. Leaf springs and a solid axle, it's never going to be world beating, but all the same I think that perhaps Mark is right about the springing not being quite right on this one. In every other way though, it looks amazing, fabulous interior, absolutely stunning car. Thank you all so much for having watched. If you have a car, if you want me to do a review on one of your cars, then please get in touch and let me know. This is the best way to contact me. And I really look forward to seeing you for the next video. Thank you so much. See you soon.